DevOps. Auf die Ohren und ins Hirn. Ein Podcast rund um DevOps.
Von Dirk Söllner, Falco Werner und Luca Ingianni. Welcome to a new episode of DevOps auf die Ohren und ins Hirn, or in English, DevOps from your ears straight to your brain. Usually this is a German language podcast, but we sometimes make exceptions for international guests. Today is one such exception. My name is Luca Ingianni, and I host this podcast together with my colleagues Dirk Söllner and Falco Werner. We're DevOps consultants, trainers, and coaches, trying to get teams to work together better and create better products for their customers. Today, it will be Falco and me running the episode, and we're joined by Alden Peterson, who has lived in the DevOps and SRE and observability space throughout his career. Alden has worked as an SDET, software development engineer in test, systems development engineer, and now a senior software engineer, but has always been passionate about working in the QA and observability space. Whether that's building tools for production monitoring, DevOps tooling, or helping teams understand observability, he has spent most of his software career working to help teams have better insights and confidence into operating and building software. Alden, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So that was quite a mouthful of an introduction. That sounds like an awesome career. To be honest, I started my work as a test engineer, and to me, it's still the most fun of all the different aspects of software development. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, I like the general space. It's interesting to me to see some people really like writing feature code and like they just live for that. For me, I get bored because it feels like you're doing the same thing over and over again. And I understand why people would love that because there's something to create. I think one of the challenges, whether it's DevOps or testing or observability, is you have a lot less of a tangible thing that you're making. You might make a dashboard or you might make some metrics, and for a lot of people that's just not satisfying. It's like you spend 2 days or a week, and then what do you have? If you write feature code, it's like, look at this beautiful UI I wrote, or look at this like great service I wrote. And then kind of in this whole space of supporting engineering work, I can understand why people don't like it. I personally think it's fun because I feel like you get much more interesting challenges because you're always doing something different. You're doing kind of the same ultimate goals, but all of the tools are always different. So for me, I've loved it. My career has been very strange. Even before I was in software, I worked as a manufacturing engineer. So I worked, my background is actually mechanical engineering. So I've kind of had like I've had a very, roundabout way to get into tech. And I think it's interesting.
It is interesting, I suppose, that it seems to me, maybe that's some kind of observation bias, but there's a lot of mechanical engineers in broadly speaking, the QA space.
Yeah, I think that of all of the engineering disciplines, mechanical engineering is the closest to software because, part of the reason I ended up in software is because programming solves a lot of problems in the mechanical engineering space too. In my undergraduate, I had some internships where I basically programmed stuff. This was in VBA. So if you've ever worked in Excel and VBA, that was my introduction to learning how to program. And it was something. But there's a lot of business problems that you can solve in that space. And I think like mechanical engineering of all of the engineering disciplines has more of that. And I think too, a lot of people have this grand idea in that I'm going to design like, cars or tractors or, rocket ships. And then, you realize that, well, you might design like tiny components that go into, a larger component of that machine. And I think a lot of people get a little disillusioned by that just because, it's kind of like what I was talking about before. You want to own this thing. And it's like, I don't really want to own like, a tiny subcomponent of a subcomponent type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I like about software and mechanical engineering, since I'm a computer science for engineering master, so I see that it's helping like developing software for creating and designing mechanical systems and managing it. And that's also a part where you see the difference and the ways of integrating both ways of work.
Absolutely.
Right. Anyway, this was a very roundabout way, I think, of getting to today's topic, which is supposed to be observability. Alden, what the hell is observability?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question. So I'll give a couple different answers because I think the most common answer I think is more of like maybe I'll call it like the classical SRE approach. So, kind of like Google's SRE book, which is, I think, a little bit higher level than what I would personally define, but kind of what is going on, right, in the system. And whether that's trying to get to some sort of, error budget or, uptime percentages or, monitoring, alerting, I think that's where a lot of people gravitate. I think from my perspective, it's more like what is giving you confidence that what you're building and operating works. Is that, and this is where I think, when we first met, I think some of our conversations are, so I've kind of lived in the QA space. I have very strong opinions about QA, and I think longer term QA and SRE and even DevOps all kind of merge together because they're all kind of answering that same question, which is how do we know that we can have confidence that what we're building works? And then also how do we actually do it, right? Like, so I think like there's an aspect to observability, which is kind of philosophical, but then tactically, I think it breaks down and I can talk more about this too. I can go on for a long time because this is interesting to me, but I think QA is a big part of observability. I think DevOps, which is very much an overloaded term, but the DevOps like methodology, I think, is a lot of observability. If you're going to fully do CI/CD, you have to know what's going on, right? You can't just like ship code to prod and just like cross your fingers that it works. If you're doing really continuous deployment, you need to have some idea that what I just deployed works. Maybe that's metrics coming off the service. Maybe that's some smoke testing. Maybe that's, some sort of synthetic monitoring. So you're running customer. You have to have something. Otherwise, you have no idea what you're deploying to prod. And I think like that's an aspect to observability. And I guess I'd be curious what you both would define observability as too. I found that it's one of those terms that a lot of people have very different interpretations on, kind of based on their background and where specifically they look at.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, because similarly to DevOps, I'm kind of struggling how to define observability, because I suppose some people define it from a very technical point of view, right? It's it's the thing with the dashboards or something like that. Same like to quite a few people, DevOps is about CI pipelines, which in a sense it is, but on the other hand, those people, I suppose, are missing the point, aren't they? And man, maybe that's the same way it works for observability, isn't it?
Yeah, I think from when I think about stuff, whether it's observability, QA, and really even DevOps, like I think it's easier to define it with kind of like the high level vision. So like I've talked with a lot of folks on my team that my job is to bring confidence to the SDLC. So whether that's building, whether that's releasing, whether that's deploying, whether that's testing, all of that sort of parts of the SDLC. And I think observability is how you actually trust that your confidence works, right? You can't, you can build this really cool system, but if you don't actually understand what the system is doing, like, are you really going to get that confidence? And I think for most people, that answer is no, especially when you start considering, okay, well, maybe the engineers trust this system. And like, candidly, I think engineers are much more willing to trust really opaque black box systems that, they understand it worked at one point and it probably works now. But I think once you start expanding more towards product management or engineering leadership, there's not quite the same confidence that gives, because some sort of bash script that's in the build process that does a bunch of magic isn't really going to give your PM a lot of confidence generally. And so I think like some of the outward artifacts of, what are we testing? What are we monitoring? What are we seeing about our production system? How do we debug errors? I think you do need something more dashboardy. I don't like calling it just dashboards because there's so much more to this than just dashboards, but you need something more tangible so that you can actually have conversations with people other than the people who are very intimately aware of the system.
That's so interesting. This whole conversation about trust, like, can you trust your system? Can you know that it works like on a visceral level?
Yeah, that's the word I often use is confidence, because I think, if you work in the tech world very long, you'll know like you're never going to have 100% confidence, right? Because, like last, was it December, Log4j, right? I don't think anybody on the planet would have thought, oh, I'm going to expect that a core library in the Java library is going to cause a giant headache. It's like there's reasonable assumptions you take. And I think when we start thinking about confidence, one of the reasons I like thinking about it in this way is that it's just a risk analysis, right? You're wanting to lower the risk of whatever, whether that's buggy features, whether that's I don't know, one of the things we've been dealing with is someone's basically doing a denial of service attack on one of our services. You're wanting confidence that you can handle those sorts of things, but also that it just works. And I think one of the interesting parts of observability, and this goes across whether it's kind of the DevOps aspects of observability, the SRE aspects, or the QA aspects, is you could spend years on a relatively basic system to get 100% confidence. And you won't get 100%, but maybe you get 5 nines of confidence or something silly, but like all of us work in companies where we can't just dedicate that much effort into things. And so you have to be very pragmatic about, okay, what is actually important to do? And for me, I think that's an interesting thing because it's just you have to make analysis around what gives you that confidence. And whether you call that trust, I think trust is a very similar thing. I think I would probably call that the same. I think Luca used the word trust, confidence. I like the word confidence because I think for non-engineers, I find that that word resonates more. Because I think people outside of the engineering space are like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if this is going to work. Like, you guys are releasing this large chunk of software and how do we know it's going to work? I think there's a confidence factor there that it resonates more, but I think it's basically trust, right?
It's both. It's both feelings from what I would say. So how do you get those types of feelings into people? So what do they need to be trusty or to have confidence in the product?
So that's a really interesting question because I think that can depend entirely on what the existing failure modes have been, as well as kind of the more holistic, what should you be doing with, I'm saying should is maybe not the right word. What is the ideal instrumentation, telemetry, whatever, observability aspects? I think one of the interesting things, I joined my current team the end of last year, and it was interesting because some of the major pain points that my team was having were very specific to certain failure modes. Like we had random production blips, like stuff and it was like 2-3 minutes. And so it's very hard to track down. And so from a confidence perspective, it's a lot easier if you say, okay, well, I'm going to like prove that those are happening because now you can prove that they're not happening. And so on my team, that was a very key thing for me when I first joined was, okay, let's set up some just like really basic checks to see what our site's doing on a regular basis. And so in that case, that's a major confidence booster. It's a major insight into what is causing the lack of confidence, I should say. Knowing that your site goes down on knowing the exact times is actually confidence inspiring versus it just randomly goes down and we don't understand it, but we know we get random customer reports that we can't really reproduce. And I think like one of the challenges, and so one of the reasons I think like the QA, SRE, DevOps space all kind of eventually merge together is because I think one of the pitfalls of having those as separate orgs or separate silos or separate disciplines or whatever you want to call that is that each of those has a very different answer to the question that you just asked. Because QA, for example, is going to say, well, any bugs are problems. DevOps, if I broadly generalize and say anybody with a DevOps title, which we could probably have a whole conversation in that nobody should have the DevOps title, but that's a common enough thing in org still that's like, well, the underlying infrastructure is stable. And, if you're an SRE, like how do those kind of interact together? But like, you're more looking at much more the customer impacting aspect of that. And I think like all of those are parts of the answer to the question that you just asked. And I think one of the challenges is, especially in an org, if you have like a dedicated QA org and a dedicated like some sort of infrastructure organization, you end up with each of those groups caring about very specific windows into that observability question. And then I don't know that I've seen, at least in my experience, I would actually be curious if you both have seen this, but I don't see a lot of reconciliation of how all of those pieces fit together. Because they all do fit together, right? If you have let's say your infrastructure is bad, in one of my previous companies, we dealt with this all the time. We ran into all sorts of failures on like test deployments because the infrastructure underlying the whole thing was just flaky. And so is that like a QA problem? Is that an infrastructure problem? It's like, no, it's this confidence observability issue, right?
Yeah, but isn't this exactly this model of the wall of confusion that, is this sort of founding myth of DevOps, right? That you don't make this distinction of, production being up is Ops' problem and bugs not being present is Dev's problem. And you replace that by the common perspective, are we providing value to the customer? By, shipping a feature and making sure that it's stable. If we can't achieve both of those, then we're all, missing the point, aren't we?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That's one of the things I struggle with is what do I describe myself as? Like I don't want to I'm not a DevOps engineer. I'm not a QA person. And so I've started calling myself an applied SRE. This isn't really the right terminology because there's a whole bunch of pitfalls with that title too. But like, I like the idea, and Luca, to your point, I think you want someone on the team who can think about those sorts of things, and like that's the team question. Like the full stack engineer approach has become really common, and that's in an ideal world. Then your team owns, your infrastructure, you own your deployments, you own everything, and then the team can be responsible for that, but you need that team, someone on the team to kind of understand and care about this issue. And that's, in my experience, one of the challenges in this space is that there's so much going on from a prioritization perspective that it's very challenging for folks to really not so much care, but have the ability to care. If you're required to ship features and kind of you're accountable for features, observability can very easily slip away. And whether that's observability through like testing, whether that's observability through monitoring, whether that's pipeline, like the more quote unquote DevOpsy side of the release process, it's very easy in my experience to see that kind of slip away as a secondary concern, which, I'm pretty pragmatic. Sometimes that is the case. If you're a startup, like you might not have the budget to like survive long enough if, you don't ship feature code. Your company might die. You might go bankrupt if you don't have.
In which case, yet again, you're not providing value to the customer. So you can still very easily loop it back to, am I offering the best value to my customer, either through stability or through my existence?
Yeah, and that's like, I think one of the things that I like doing, I haven't really thought of the phrasing, the value to the customer. But I think that's very similar to kind of how I've thought about this, because you want to determine like what actually matters. Not being like, oh, we need monitoring because we need monitoring for the sake of monitoring. Like, I think all of us would probably agree monitoring is almost always valuable, but that doesn't mean that every single project needs somebody who's, creating tons of dashboards and tons of metrics. Like, because at some points it just doesn't matter. If you build an internal app, one of the apps I wrote years ago now was a team. I sat on the team. I was on the team I was writing this for, and I had some like really basic error handling. So any error got emailed to me. This is, I wouldn't really say this is like the best observability, but it was good enough for that team, because the most, they sat next to me. If something really went wrong, they would just walk over 10, a meter, 5 meters, whatever, and go say, hey, Alden, what's up with this? So like, there's a different level of observability there. And I think it is a challenge, because I have found, especially in the QA space, that there's a very like idealistic approach when it comes to a lot of the things. It's like, you need to do this because this is important, and it misses the practical realities that everybody is busy and there's almost always more than you can do than actually do. And I think really the way you're describing it is kind of, I actually like, I'll probably steal that and use that terminology, because I think that is like a better way to talk about that trade-off.
It's also interesting what you talked about in terms of, do you treat this as a QA problem or how do you look at it? It reminds me of myself when I decided I was going to be a freelancer. I thought, you know what, I'm going to be a professional QA person because testing is fun. This is going to be awesome. And I came to the shocking realization that I could not actually offer quality to my customers unless I took control of the entire SDLC. And so I accidentally found myself doing DevOps by necessity. That's so funny, because that is how I got into DevOps, sort of falling backwards into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's very similar to my approach. My first, I guess you could call it a QA job, was when I was hired as an SDET, or software development engineer and test, which, speaking of titles that are kind of meaningless. But, one of the first things that I did on that team was I realized like the PR process just was bad because the build took forever. And so people would, just not really pay attention to it. And it was just a headache. And like, really, I think one of the first things I did on that team that really improved the overall quality of the product is I just reduced the entire CI process time by, and in that case, nobody had looked at it. It was really, this is years later, so I can say it was pretty easy if you just look at it and spend the time to do it. I think it was something like an 80% reduction in the total CI time. And it's like, nobody just put the time in to look at that. I think part of it is that is like a QA concern. I think I've talked to a lot of people. Like, I think QA, you end up going to the DevOps side for the exact same reasons you were talking about, Luca, that you end up with, okay, so I can write a bunch of tests, but like a bunch of tests don't matter, because when do I execute these tests? How do they get executed? Well, you have to think about where the deployment process is. Okay, now you're talking about the deployment process. So now you're thinking about the pipeline if you're using some sort of pipeline thing. And now suddenly you're thinking about like the whole DevOps philosophy. And I think that that's almost a requirement if you want to have like a QA process that's not just write some tests that get executed against like a, I don't know, build or a test environment.
Yeah. Okay. So, what is the, I don't know, system of observability looking into? Is it all of those things? The software itself, the pipeline, the people?
I think, yeah. I think a lot of this will, again, depend on what your role is on the team. Because I think like leadership will say it's all of those. I don't know that. I mean, it's a challenge, right? Because where does that bubble stop? One of the things that I've often told people is that most of the hard technical problems aren't really technical problems, but they're like a mix of how people and technology are interacting. And I think observability is almost perfectly in this, right? Like one of the things that I've talked to a lot of people about is I tell people if you're not going to action an alert, either turn it off entirely or put it into a channel that's basically like ignored alerts or something. Some people just have like an obsessive, I really want to see all these alerts because I don't understand it. I can't empathize with it because for me, any sort of alert noise just drives me nuts. But some people really have a hard time turning off an alert that they know is valuable, but don't do anything with. And I think like that's a very interesting combination of like a people and a technology thing, right? Because you can have a bunch of valid alerts that should be done something with. But if nobody's doing something with them, is that a technological problem or is that a people problem? And I don't think you can answer that either way. I think it's a mix because, maybe there's an aspect to people want to, but they're just so overloaded because they have so many, maybe product management is pushing a ton of like, we need to do feature. And, the poor engineers are just feeling guilty about these alerts they're ignoring. That's probably not a common situation. Sometimes people just don't care. Some automated template creates a bunch of alerts and then there's, either they don't understand why the alerts could be useful or they don't correlate to any sort of, customer impact. So it's kind of just like, well, whatever. And I think it's definitely a mix. I think it's easier to focus on the technical side. And I think this is one of the things where I think, going back to the beginning, I think a lot of observability stuff that I've read focuses more on the technical side because it's easier to quantify. It's easier to look at, let's look at availability and uptime, right? Like this is a good example. You can measure it, and people like metrics, it's a good, and the metrics are valuable. And it's easier to say, okay, we're making an impact because we went from, 98% uptime to 99.5% or, something like that. And I think like a lot of times the people aspect can get missed because it's harder. You're both consultants, so you probably deal with this all the time. You're basically doing, I would guess, and this is speculation since I'm not on your roles, but I would guess that the technical parts are really easy. It's the parts of getting people to adopt them and changing people's either preconceived notions or some of the, organizational challenges that make doing more of DevOps harder. Like that's been the experience I've had. I'm actually really curious if that's how you would both say it too, from kind of the consulting side, doing on the DevOpsy side.
Yeah, it's both. I think you have to have people with the skills to get the things up and running, and to find a good starting point to measure. I think sometimes you have no measurements at all, except how many bugs or service requests or issues are coming in. So that's kind of the first level of transparency or measurement or looking into service availability or uptime, whatever. And then when you start, you get into it step by step and need to develop skills in terms of tools, in terms of how to work with the data that you can get and measure the important things, or at least alert on the things that are helpful for the customers, for the team as well. I would even want to step one step further back and try to get a better handle on observability. I think it's a broad term, kind of getting lots of things together. You said in a quite abstract way, create confidence, or Lucas said in also similar way to create trust or build trust. I think when I hear the term without that deep view on the technology side, I feel it's making things visible that are somewhere hidden in the black box system that you mentioned, in the processes, in the tools, in the tool chains, somehow to enable action for improvement, for support, to be able to reply to issues that are coming up, or things, to find the right spot to turn the screw and to make the system work again. Is that a similar way, or would you want to add something, or have a completely different view on observability?
I think that's good. I don't know that I would say that that's less abstract. I think, like, to make it more tangible, I think it's really like, can you easily understand what's going on? And maybe that's just a shorter way to say what you were saying. It might just be a shorter way, but I think, like, so one of the things I really like doing is setting up synthetic transactions. And so, like, basically a synthetic transaction is, hey, what's a common customer action or behavior, whether that's like a UI, clicking through an actual web interface, or whether that's an API call, whatever your customer is, and just setting up a scheduled version of that. Because, and one of the reasons I like that is because it bypasses a lot of the pitfalls of like tuning alerts, tuning metrics, and that sort of thing. And you basically say, this is what we're defining our thing that does. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's I'm trying to think of an example. Maybe you have some sort of like basic, I don't know, payment system. Well, figure out a way to run a fake payment through that system. Run it every minute or every 5 minutes or whatever. And this comes down to like, what's the customer expectations on this? But, if you run that every minute, it's kind of a non-negotiable, this is what our system is supposed to do. And if this fails, it's a big deal type of thing. And one of the reasons I like doing that, and I think that's a very insightful thing, because at first it forces you to define what is that critical path for your service or your website or whatever, whatever the application here is. It can be this applies across whether you run like an Amazon.com level website, or whether you just have a simple web service that's kind of a microservice. Your app does something fundamental that your customers or users have an expectation of, and just verify that works. And I think one of the reasons I like doing that is because it simplifies a lot of the complexity around, well, what is like, what's confidence, what, like all of those things. It's like, no, this is like what our thing is supposed to do, and it stopped doing it. That's a problem. And maybe latency matters. Maybe latency doesn't matter. You can like build into that sort of really simple check a lot of useful things. And then you also have a repeatable environment to run it from too. One of the challenges in using like real user monitoring, which I'm sure you're both familiar with that RUM, is that maybe you have the one person who's off on, rural internet in the middle of nowhere, and their site just doesn't work and it's not because of your site. It's because, they've got, 20 bits per second of, internet speed. And you don't necessarily know that from metrics. And in my experience, tuning metrics can be a lot of work, especially for lower volume sites. If you run a site like Amazon.com or, Netflix.com or something, where you're getting millions upon millions of like customer interactions potentially per second, it becomes a lot easier to define like actual metrics based on site interactions, because you have so much data available. But a lot of us work in spaces where we don't have that level of clear impacting like data. And in those cases, I really think like just doing like some sort of basic synthetic transaction can sort of answer the question that you were asking, Falco, because it's basically, what does this do? Like, what is the core value proposition? Like we're on this like podcasting app now. Like maybe they should just, that like a good example there was like, just start a podcast and verify like stuff works. That's, this Zencaster podcast, that's, it's kind of like they've got one thing, right? Like it's to record and create podcasts. And so if they wanted to know that, they could certainly try to look at metrics. I don't know how many people use this site. Maybe there's enough people using this that they could just look at how many podcasts get started and saved every X minutes and figure it out. I don't know. But, my guess is it's one of the sites where, if you looked at, midnight on Friday night, there's probably not a lot of people recording podcasts, or, like that's, one of my previous apps was heavily business cycle dependent. So we basically made an app that was used as a business app. Well, yeah, on like midnight on Saturday, almost nobody was using it. But if somebody was using it at that time, it was really, really important, because that meant some like person was doing some work that was like really time sensitive generally. And so we had to be very mindful of that, because you can look at your metrics and say, okay, great, our app is running. But then, Friday night comes and no user traffic, and somebody takes down the cluster by accident. And now you don't even know if that app is failing. I could talk a lot about this because I think synthetic transactions are a really good way to bypass a lot of the pitfalls with observability, because you don't have to tune anything. You basically decide what's the key thing here.
Okay, but now I need to ask you a question, because I'm kind of confused. Is there a difference between observability and using synthetic test cases and just fairly regular acceptance tests?
Well, so that I think it's a good question, because I think acceptance tests in some ways can be useful as synthetic transactions. I don't know that I'm not a huge fan of to the point where you have to run like a large test suite against prod. I think you can do that, but I think if you're feeling like you need to do that, it probably means you have gaps elsewhere in your process. So like, for example, and I guess let me take a step back. I think acceptance tests should be a lot more about verifying like functionality works and the integration pieces are correct, rather than necessarily is my app like core business logic working. And so in previous companies, what I've done and actually talked to people about is maybe you have 100, we'll call them either acceptance or integration tests, whatever, tests that you run against a deployed environment. You don't need to run all 100 of those as synthetics, but you might just be able to say, okay, these two are actually the core, so we'll run those two. And I think this is part of why I think like observability, QA, DevOps, SRE, all of that morphs together, because when you start thinking about it from this perspective, what you just said is a very natural thing, right? Like, let's say you have a QA org that writes tests against the test environment, and engineering org owns production monitoring, which I think is a really common situation. Actually, is you have like QA that only cares about pre-prod, and then the engineering org cares about prod. Well, like, what's the point in doing the same thing twice then? You're basically having the same thing happening twice. It's just different capacities. And so this gets to what you were saying, Luca, where QA starts morphing into the whole SDLC very quickly when you start thinking about it like that.
Okay, so maybe at this point we really need to pull back a little bit and kind of figure out what is the relationship between QA and DevOps and observability, and if you want also SRE. How do they fit together? How are they traditionally viewed as separate, and should they be viewed that same way still? I'm guessing your answer will be no.
Yeah. So I think from my perspective, the QA industry is undergoing a similar transition that kind of the systems administrator DevOps side of did. And I mean, it's still undergoing, and that is, I think people are recognizing that you can't have this siloed component to your engineering org as a broader whole, because with SaaS, I guess we should probably clarify, a lot of this mostly applies to SaaS because it's very easy, for example, to roll back software in the SaaS space generally. One of my previous companies, I worked for John Deere, and if we, one of the teams that I was close to, the team I was on, they did the firmware update types of stuff. So they would do over the wire updates. Well, that's a very different failure mode. If you screw that up, you could potentially like brick or prevent every single piece of equipment that's out on the field from working. That's a very different failure mode. And so I think with SaaS, it's a little easier to trust in like a process that will auto rollback, for example. And so that disclaimer aside, I think QA historically has tried to answer like, do we have bugs in the product? And often that happens on like, do we have bugs in the product? Let's make sure we don't have bugs in the product before we deploy to production. I think I'm generalizing horribly, but I think that's a pretty decent explanation of what QA often is. And so you'll often see orgs who have quality problems say, let's hire a bunch of QA people so we can make sure we don't have bugs before we ship it to the customer.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'd never thought about it in those terms, but it sounds like what you're saying is the harder it is for you to deploy software, either for reasons within your product, like, it's a tractor, or because your processes are just terrible. So the harder it is to deploy into prod, the more you need a separate QA stage and a separate QA team that makes sure that nothing bad goes into prod.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I think there is an aspect to this that if you've made the process hard, and it doesn't have to be hard, you create a higher chance that you have issues. Like if, let's say you have, like going back to this podcast app, let's say they push updates once a year. Well, it's almost guaranteed. Like I think most people in tech would say that's probably more likely to cause major issues than if they ship once a week or every commit or some variant on that. So I think you do have to be a little careful. Now, that being said, I think like oftentimes people's first tendency is, okay, we have quality problems. Let's batch up all of our releases so we can make sure that they work right. And you kind of get yourself into this cycle. But I think one of the things I try to be careful of is in these sorts of conversation is recognizing there are valid cases where a lot of this is there's just different constraints. I'm not sure the spaces I've lived in and I actually much prefer because of this are like the SaaS spaces where we're deploying some sort of web application or some sort of internal service that it's really nice to not have to worry about a lot of like, I've not worked for companies where there's major compliancy things, like this whole conversation changes a little bit if you start talking about, well, maybe you make medical software, or maybe you make software for governmental approval processes. But I'm just kind of ignoring that space. I'm probably not the right person for that because there's a lot of regulatory issues there.
Yeah, but let me speak to that a little bit because I have worked on safety critical software before, like up to ACLD, which means that if your component fails, somebody's going to die. And that does influence the way you build your product, doesn't it? But it only really changes sort of the last step, which is actually moving it into production, like bolting it into a vehicle in our case. All of the rest is still very much the same. And all of these considerations that we talked about in terms of production software would maybe just be, would be worked on in a pre-production setting, if it's a physical thing, in a prototype environment, in a test drive environment, stuff like that. So we're still back to the same confidence conversation. We just need to be sure that our confidence level is way, way higher before we actually unleash this on the unsuspecting public, right?
Right. And this conversation's been pretty philosophical. And I think one of the things that from my perspective is the case is that a lot of the way you help influence people on this topic is just thinking about this differently. I think we've had a lot of like higher level conversation here, like without as much technical stuff. And I think that's, from my perspective, that's the hard part. The technical part often is pretty straightforward, but that's also very specific to whether it's the constraints that you're dealing with. We were just talking about, whether it's safety critical software, there's going to be different constraints than, I don't know, making like the next social media app. But I think like one of the things is like this whole philosophy, I think if you're really thinking about observability from a more holistic perspective and you're really understanding what is this idea of observability trying to do, I think it really translates really nicely to any of the domains that you're in. A lot of the times it's like, and this is something I have definitely experienced, is if you've worked in a place where you have decent observability around your software process, I love writing code in that situation because I just don't worry. I trust that if I merge code, it'll either work, it'll either be some weird edge case I didn't know about, or I'll get an alert or something will fail. And I love that. And I think like that observability like is like kind of the key to get you there. And again, I think like this, because we were, I think, talking about this right at the beginning, where is the boundary of observability? And I think you can make it wherever you want. You can really tightly scope it to say like observability is production monitoring and production alerting. And I think, I guess you could do that, but I think really you're trying to like that confidence answer is the whole process. You can even say like build time observability too. A lot of people have like dealing issues with flaky tests. Like that's a common thing. And we can call it flaky unit test, flaky integration test, whatever. Well, like if you don't know, like let's say that one of them is super flaky all the time, it's gonna like break your confidence in the build, and it's gonna break your confidence that like those unit tests are actually useful. And maybe you just don't understand like that test fails 50% of the time. And like I think some of the newer like APM like tools are doing a lot of work in this space. Like Datadog I know of is building at some sort of flaky test detector. And part of the reason is because if you can start getting rid of those false positives, it's the same as alerting. If you're dealing with production alerts, false positives are the worst, especially if you're talking about paging. If you page someone with a false positive, you're basically ruining the ability for people to care about production pages very quickly because, it's the natural human instinct. If you keep telling me, hey, something's on fire, and I look and it's like there's nothing on fire, and then you do it 5 times in a row, like it's a normal human response. I think I don't fault people at all for not paying attention or not caring about things. Like, why would you care about, if you have an alert channel that is a stream of alerts that nobody cares about because they're pointless, and then there's one that matters, why would in the world would somebody actually look at that? But I think like there's an aspect to this where all of this kind of this thinking approach and this philosophy approach is very useful for creating more of the tactical side of things on like, what does that look like tactically? Well, it's going to look different tactically. One of the challenges I have when I talk with people is I've had a lot of conversations now where it's something along the lines of, hey, we're thinking about QA. We don't really know what we want, and we don't really want QA, but we like know you've got opinions on this topic. How to think about this? And a lot of times people are basically saying like, we lack confidence in our release process. We lack confidence in production monitoring, but we don't know how to talk about it. I'm sure if that makes sense, but I think like it's harder for me to tactically like describe, a lot of times I think people are looking for like, here, what are the 5 things I can do? Like we have observability problems, we have quality problems, we have observability problems, we have whatever. And people are like, give me the 5 tactical things. And I think people like jump to that. And I think it's more, you need to think about it, like kind of the way we've been talking about it. And then the tactical things become really obvious, I think, because, it might look like something like, I'm trying to think here, maybe you have production incidents that take 2 hours to debug because you can't figure out what's going on. Like that's a really clear tactical win pretty quickly. There's a lot of the philosophical side of things that I think translates at an organization level pretty easily. And I think that applies really like this whole space, whether that's, and I'm kind of just going on like a rabbit trail, as they say here, but like, QA is the same thing, observability, whether that's like the SDLC observability, whether that's the DevOps side of things and how the infrastructure works, how that all works. Like I think it's all kind of the same thing.
Yeah, and I think what the thing is the system, which is the product itself plus the people building it and operating it. This whole looping structure, feedback structure, needs to work smoothly if you want to have trust in your system. If you want to feel confident that it does the job, that it does deliver value to the customer, and this is, I think, where it closes the loop, and where you say, if I have flaky tests, well, that breaks that system, doesn't it? It doesn't break it in the let's call it forward direction of features flowing towards the customer, but it does break the feedback direction, and as such, it will break the system as a whole.
Yeah, and I think, Falco, you were asking this question earlier, like, is it a people or is it a technology thing? And I think this is why it's hard for me to answer that. When we think about more of like, do you have production, like for more of like the production monitoring or production kind of incident responses? Yes, it's both. Look at what you're saying. It's like, do you have runbooks?
I think it's not hard to answer at all, because the system is both the technology and the people. If you don't have the people as the sort of reactive, creative part of the system, then, who's going to react to problems? Of course, it's going to be the people. Yes, of course, they need technological support, be it dashboards or be it something else that enables them to observe what's going on, hence observability, and react to it in a meaningful way. But I think here we are.
Okay, but are you measuring or evaluating the responses of the human or social part of the system as well? Is this part of observability? Do you look into it?
So that is a harder question for me to answer. And I think the reason that it's harder is I would answer yes, but I think I'm also aware that becomes very challenging based on where people's abilities to influence on organizations are to say yes. I think for the average engineer, I think the answer to that's more of a no, because so much of that is organizational and prioritization. Like, for example, I think at the very beginning, we were talking a little bit about whether if you're being pushed to create features, if you're getting, like, let's say 100% of your bandwidth is allocated towards feature development and you want to put time into, say, observability or monitoring or testing, any of that sort of stuff, it's hard for me to say that that's the engineer's problem to deal with. That's much more of an organizational issue as far as how the organization prioritizes like the SDLC engineering work. And I think it depends on your role. And so if, like, let's say if you're an engineering manager listening to this or a PM listening to this, I think the answer is a lot more of a, yeah, it's your responsibility to balance, like we had a relatively minor incident recently, but like I'm very glad we had it, because it was a very clear, okay, these are the areas we had problems addressing this incident. And if we have a real issue on like when this product is more actively used, we're gonna have some serious issues because of these things. And that was very easy for our PM to go, wow, yeah, okay, let's prioritize that. And so I think, I don't know if I'd call that a metric, though, like more, it's not a metric, you can't quantify what are the gaps, but being able to quantify the risks, I think is really helpful. And you could call that a metric. I mean, you can't put like a specific risk to it, but I think that's one of the things from my perspective that I think is really important in this whole thing too, because, like, let's be honest, the reality is most of us work in non-life or death situations. Luca, you were talking about that, people could potentially die in your thing. Most of us don't work on that type of system. And so the reality is when we talk about the risk trade-off of how do we get confidence, the desired confidence doesn't have to be 100.0%. Most of us are, I don't know what percentage, I don't want to put a number here because I'll get a bunch of people saying, oh, it needs to be slightly higher. But, most of us are below 100% for what we need from like a business perspective confidence. And so, but you need to be able to more tangibly say, okay, we don't have good logging. We don't have good monitoring. We don't have good like understanding as to what's going on. So if we have another issue in prod, we might have to, wait several hours to make a new build that has more debugging or, something like that. I think being able to quantify that from an engineering perspective can be still useful. But ultimately, I think if you live in an organization where the value incentive structure is just not going to support that, I don't think you can you're kind of stuck. And so that's where I think it's hard to say it's a people problem as an engineer. But I think, if you're in the leadership role or you have influence on this, it's absolutely a mix of both.
I'm also sort of thinking back to when I was working in safety critical products, having this awareness that people's lives depended on you doing your job well gave a lot of clarity to those conversations because, it was much easier to say, no, I don't feel confident shipping this yet. And everybody would be like, oh, okay. It's like, okay, fine, we have deadlines, but also we potentially have dead people. So I know where my trade-off lies.
One of the reasons I don't like having a separate QA org is because I think you want the QA org to be responsible for answering that same type of, with more of a risk analysis rather than we don't want bugs. Because in companies that there's a separate QA org, I think what happens is QA feels responsible for stopping all bugs, period. Not stopping enough bugs to justify like still shipping. And so I think one of the reasons I'm pretty passionate that I think QA should be ultimately reporting to the leader who's responsible for the product, whether that's a first line engineering manager, whether that's like a director, it doesn't really matter. But like, I think QA is providing that insight. And this goes back to your question, Falco, really about people or process or people or technology. Yeah. Like QA needs to bring the risks up. But if ultimately product or engineering or whoever's making that decision says that's an acceptable risk, I don't have a problem with that. As long as it's an intentional decision. I do have a problem if it's a non-intentional decision. It just happens. And I think that's unfortunately often the case where people don't consciously think about it and just say, well, we need to ship this or whatever.
Yeah. And yet again, this reminds me of one of the projects I was working on was a steering column lock. So it was an amazingly stupid piece of hardware. It could go click or clack, right? And there was because it was safety critical, there was a very deliberate, very careful risk assessment. And of course, the assessment said, actually, it opening at the wrong point in time is completely irrelevant. Like, whatever, let it open. The only people who are going to complain about it are the car insurance, whatever. But if you're going 200 kilometers an hour down the Autobahn and this thing closes, you're going to have a bad day. And having this clarity about your risk assessment. And so for the same sort of bolt moving, we had very different risk assessments for it moving forwards and for it moving backwards. One was whatever, and the other one was highly, highly safety critical. And by the way, even in this case, we could not possibly go for 100% safety because that would have required infinite effort.
Yeah, that's a good example too. We've been talking about this. One of the interesting things to me in a lot of this space, and I think if it's having a mechanical engineering background, we're both coming from like a very different background, but it's like observability. Like I think in tech, there's a common thing like, oh, this is like, we are like unique, special like industry. We're the only industry that ever deals with problem XYZ. And like, I don't know, maybe it's because I came from like a different industry. It's not that way to like, and so it's that issue you're talking about. I think it's like the same thing that like at a core observability and monitoring, or it's all trying to answer there, right? If other industries have the same challenges too, and maybe that's why it's easier for me to think about this in more of a philosophical sense. When I was an intern, I was working on a project with an anhydrous ammonia, which is not something you want to be around if it goes wrong. It's a bad day because it's a very dangerous thing. It's used in farming and fertilizing, and it's kind of the same thing you were just talking about, right? Like there's a very different risk factor there. We were doing something because farmers are they're very prone to just doing what they want because they want to do it and like customizing stuff. So you have to be really careful because it's not just like somebody randomly shifting wrong on the interstate or on the Autobahn. It's like oh, I want this just to work differently, so I'm going to go in and like change how this works, types of things. And it's just a different failure mode, but it's like the same problems. You have the same thing. Like, is this working the way it's supposed to? You have all of this problems. And then you want to build systems to prevent it from being, like in that case, like a safety concern. But it's fundamentally like you want to build processes to prevent and be aware of when things aren't working right. Well, it's like that's like the same thing we've just been talking about in the software industry. Like
Yes.
It's the exact same thing. It's now certainly the tooling is different. You're not going to put like synthetic transactions, going back to that, on these sorts of things, but like it's the same fundamental philosophy. And that's, I think earlier I was talking about that, and I think back to that point of it's the way you like help people influence people is you just think about it like this. I think all of us probably just kind of naturally think about this as kind of a risk assessment or prioritization assessment when you're talking to people. Like, I think we all naturally think of it that way just because of the nature of our roles. But I don't know that a lot of people see it as like it's just more, well, I'm not directly responsible for this, so I have a whole bunch of other work, so I guess I'll do that. I don't think people are consciously doing that. So that's one of the things I've talked to a lot of people internally here about is if this is good and you want to make it, if you believe in this as a priority, then you have to shift priorities, period. Like, you can't just like tack it on.
Okay, dear listeners, as we were recording this podcast, we discovered that we couldn't really do the topic justice in just one episode. And so while we were doing the recording, we decided we were going to keep going and record a second half of this conversation and publish that as a separate episode. So this is the end of this first episode, which was maybe on a somewhat higher level, on more of a level of philosophy of culture. And in the next episode, we will try to go down to a more practical level and talk about how to actually implement observability in your own organizations, in your own products. So please stay tuned for the second episode of this conversation, for the second half of this conversation with Alden, which I think you'll enjoy greatly. I know I did.